values.
And while Slovakia says it will respect the court's decision, it has no intention of changing its migration policy. Some Western European countries are calling on Brussels to cut funding from the two reluctant states if they don't comply with the court. However, there's a chance that too heavy a punishment might only stoke anti-EU sentiment, further dividing an already fractured Europe.
Well, for more on that, I'm joined here in the studio by Arezo Malakooti. She's a lawyer and an independent researcher for migration. Thanks for being with us here on France 24 tonight. Now, Hungary's argument is that by accepting this relatively small number of refugees, they will simply encourage more people to try and make the crossing to Europe. We saw those scenes in 2014, 2015, 10,000 people a day sometimes walking through Hungary. They don't want that to happen anymore, and they think it's unfair that the EU is imposing this on them.
Yes, I think that it's an interesting statement because I think what we have seen in the last few years is that actually there hasn't been a repeat of those numbers that we saw in 2015. And since the EU-Turkey deal, there has been a change in the numbers arriving. But what we are seeing is that the frontline countries such as Greece and Italy are dealing with a very high number of migrants and asylum seekers that are stranded in their countries now. And it's those individuals that need to be let's say, relocated so that the burden can be shared amongst the various EU countries. But in terms of acting as a pull factor for more to be coming, there's no evidence to suggest that, actually, at the moment.
This plan is failing. 120,000 refugees were supposed to have been resettled by this month. Less than 40,000 have already. What is the EU's policy long term? Because this is simply not working, is it?
Yes. It's difficult for me to say what the EU's policy is on the long term, but I think that...
what would you like it to be?
I think that the issue here is not so much the EU policy, but more the question of solidarity amongst the various EU nations. And I think it's really the migration question is becoming a key question for the EU and testing its ability to act as a regional bloc that has a number of nations working together. So I think that is more the key question here, because while countries like Hungary and Poland are making statements such as the migrants don't want to come to our country anyway, so why should we accept them? The reality is that most of them don't want to be in Italy and Greece either. So it really is a question for the entire bloc to look at. It is really a matter of needing to work together to find solutions. So I think that the issue is not so much the EU's ability to make laws on this, but rather the question of solidarity amongst the various EU countries.
Why do you think there is such opposition to accepting these refugees? Is it because they're from another culture, another religion? Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, these are countries with strong Christian populations. Is that the problem here?
I think that's the way it's being framed, and I think that the migration has become such a politicized issue over the last few years that I think a lot of countries are making decisions based on what is more popular at elections rather than what is actually the most effective solution for the issue at hand. And so definitely in a lot of these countries it's framed as an issue of different religions, different cultures, a difficulty integrating, but I think it's really just the politicization of the issue.
It's about numbers as well, isn't it? Because we have seen really large numbers of people arriving in a pretty short time span since 2014. 1.7 million people trying to make their homes in Europe. I mean, those kind of numbers are not sustainable, are they?
No, but if we look at the numbers more carefully, it paints a different picture. So if we look at, for example, 2014, we had, well, let's put it this way. In 2015, around 1 million of that 1.7 million arrived in 2015 alone. So when we look at 2016, for example, we had 180,000 individuals arrive in Italy, and we had about 170,000 individuals arrive in Greece, and around 4,000 arrive in Spain. So actually in 2016, the numbers were closer to 350,000. So often that figure is quoted to create a sense of alarm, but actually it was that 1 year of 2015 where we saw the big numbers arrive. And the reason why that's changed now is because of the EU-Turkey deal has affected the numbers of arrivals.
Because that is putting a lot of people off from trying to make the journey.
Yeah.
What about the argument that that the war in Syria is hopefully temporary? It will be over one of these days. That it would be better for people who do want to stay in their home countries, who want to stay in Iraq and Syria. Ultimately, it would be better for them to stay in refugee camps around those countries. What do you think of that? An argument used by the British, for example.
I think that when we look at the Syrian crisis, in the first few years of the Syrian crisis between, say, 2011 and 2014, the majority of Syrians were living in neighbouring countries to Syria, and we didn't see Syrians arriving in Europe for this reason precisely, because they were waiting for the crisis to end so they could return home, because they didn't want to leave their homes. But the reason why we started to see Syrians moving to Europe in 2014 and onwards was because they realised that there was no end in sight, and the war has continued. And even if the war was to end tomorrow, most of their homes are destroyed and there's nothing to go back to. And this is the reality today for Syria, that even if the war ends tomorrow, what are Syrians going to return to, actually? All
right. Arezo Malakooti, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Well, joining me now on the line is Zoltan Kovacs, a spokesman for the Hungarian government. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. First of all, then, Mr. Orban, he's tried to stand up to the European Union, but he lost today, didn't he? The EU will not pay for that border fence, and you will have to accept your fair share of refugees. This is a failure for him, isn't it?
Well, today's court decision has nothing to do about fair share in border protection, and European solidarity is shown to Hungary.
No, but they have made a statement today saying that they will not be paying for that. They don't pay for border fences.
Yes, but you also have to know that Mr. Orban has also answered the letter from Mr. Juncker. And we believe that Hungary, being the first actually who responded by action, not by calling for help and asking for money, but from Hungarian taxpayer money, we acted and we have increased border protection personnel. We have built a fence and also introduced measures that help protecting not only the Hungarian but the European border, as it is required by the Schengen and other protocols that are in place in the European Union.
You have a population of over 9 million people in Hungary. You're being asked to take in around 1,200 people. Is it really worth declaring war on Brussels and on the EU over such a tiny number of people?
And well, most definitely it's not about the numbers. For the past 3 years, Hungary has taken more than the quota would subscribe to Hungary.
But zero under this scheme?
But zero to that scheme. We have taken proper refugees who have an entitlement to step on Hungarian soil, wanted to stay in Hungary, and were in need of some kind of legal protection in hundreds every year. So altogether for the past 3 years, if I'm right, above 100,000. 1,400. The thing is that we believe that the quota system itself is a bad idea. The way it was extracted, today's court decision suggests was right, but we believe is against the will, not only of the Hungarian people, but many other member states. And most certainly, it is going around the will of the heads of state. So what we see here is a legal debate. Today's court decision was about the procedure the decision was made. And very obviously, Hungary is going to pursue its fight against the quota system, the decisions, at all possible legal possibilities in the future.
Right. Now, this policy was a response, wasn't it, by the EU to an extraordinary situation, well over 1.5 million people trying to come to Europe. It is designed not essentially to help the refugees, but to ease the burden on your fellow EU members, that is Greece and Italy, who are on the front line and who are being overwhelmed with the number of arrivals. Do you not feel any sense of solidarity with your fellow EU member states?
Well, we have to remind your viewers and listeners that this is not exactly the case if it's about 2015. In that year, Hungary has witnessed over 400,000 people crossing its borders, heading to Western Europe. So you don't, and not anybody in Western Europe has to teach a lesson on us how to take a fair share and burden of what has happened back in 2015. Now, the situation, as we all know, was disorderly. What we are calling for is that the first measurement for solidarity, if there's any measure at all, is keeping the rules. And that's what we've seen for the past 2 years, that instead of keeping the old rules, the existing rules of the European Union, some started to suggest a new one, and that is the quota. We don't believe the quota, again, is a good idea. It's unexecutable, as we see. Nobody's staying where he or she is being assigned. So why are we going for a new measurement and then untenable solution or treatment of the migration crisis instead of keeping the existing rules, which are the clear and exact elements of solidarity? And that's why we have asked for reimbursing the extraordinary costs Hungary has paid for the past couple of years, and that is over 880 million euros altogether.
The migration crisis has been one of the biggest challenges to the European Union for many years, the biggest migrant crisis in the world since the Second World War. If you don't agree with the EU's way of doing things, with the EU policy, why do you not consider following the British and leaving the EU altogether?
Well, with all due respect, this is a stupid question because we believe that the European Union. Again,
well, that's one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons that Britain cited leaving the EU to control its borders.
Well, one reason behind the British leaving the European Union was bad decisions on behalf of the European institutions. Now we would like the European institutions to take good measures and good decisions instead of continuing on the path which is again untenable. So again, with all due respect, the question is silly and stupid because it's not about leaving the European Union. It's about the European Union following its own rules. As a matter of fact, constituting the kind of solidarity that is required by the existing treaty.
Mr. Orban's, one of his election slogans is "Stop Brussels." I mean, that would sound like someone who does not want his country in the EU.
Now, it sounds like as if you wanted to stop the bad policies that are being pursued on behalf of European institutions.
All right. Zoltan Kovacs, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, moving on to other news, and